One of the things I like to start off with is when I've given these talks before across the country, again and again and again, I've been asked a few questions. And one of the questions basically is kind of the history of the project. Where did this project come from? Dr. Vansel's already kind of touched on some of this, but let me go back through and hit some of the high notes. First of all, you need to know that for the past 2 decades, I worked as both a high school social studies and history teacher, and I've also worked as a college professor teaching history and social studies methods. During that time while teaching the history courses, one of my goals has been is to improve the learning of my students in terms of history education. And I also kind of view myself as being somewhat of a public relations person and trying to convince students that history is important and they should continue to teach it and learn about it over the years. What I've discovered is that students usually come to my class, they kind of have a stereotype before class even starts, and that stereotype is that history is boring. And I've discovered that students aren't afraid to tell me that on the very first day, too, that how they're forced into my class, and this is going to be boring, like everything else like that. So that became a concern of mine. And so what I started to do as a high school teacher, and when I was teaching the survey courses at the college level, is I wanted to start asking my students on day one, what do you think history is? And I started to do that plain and simple to kind of get a dialogue and a conversation going between me and my students to kind of figure out where they were at and what they had, what preconceived notions and stereotypes they had about history before it even started. One of the best answers I had came about 3 years ago. I asked the question in class, what is history? A young man in the back of the room raised his hand. I called on him, and he said, history is the study of dead people. I informed him that that was actually mortuary science and was on the other side of campus. That's not what we'd be doing in class today here. But it was really nice. I got the opportunity to use that as an example in saying, no, we don't study dead people in history. What we actually do is we study people when they were alive. What were their actions? What were their thoughts? What did they do when they were alive that had impact on us yet to this day? What I wanted my students to understand is that history is constantly changing. There's not a rigid type of topic here. And that individual and societal perspectives, interpretation, and biases actually had an impact on how they were learning and what they were learning. Basically, what I wanted my students to learn is something called historiography. And real quickly, historiography is what we'd call the history of history. How does society have an impact on how we study history, how we learn history, how those interpretations have come back and forth again here. As Dr. Vansel mentioned, I now teach up at St. Cloud State, and this last year I was able to use a very concrete example for my students and as to what historiography is. Let me see if I can use it here real quick too. I was born and raised in Minnesota. I'm a football fan. As a football fan in Minnesota, that usually means that you are a Minnesota Vikings fan. So there's one fact that we in Minnesota know, and that is that the Green Bay Packers are evil. No question about that whatsoever. And for about 15, 16, 17 years, they had a quarterback by the name of Brett Favre, whose only purpose was to ruin Sundays for me. Somebody I could cheer against, somebody who I got sick and tired of hearing was the greatest quarterback to ever play the game. And at the end of each season, like most Minnesota Vikings fans, we prayed that this guy would just retire. Jump ahead to this last year. Now all of a sudden, us Minnesota Vikings fans have really relished in the fact that we have one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. We think he makes most of our Sundays. At the end of last season, we all sat down and prayed real quick that this guy never retires. He just keeps coming back again and again and again. I like to use that for my students to explain this is kind of what historiography is. Society, our views have changed a little bit, so our perception of what took place has actually changed as well here. As Dr. Vance also mentioned, this belief that I should get my students to understand that history has different perspectives and interpretations led to the book History Lessons, in which a colleague and I took history textbooks from around the world and we compared them to see what they were saying about the U.S. in their classrooms. So what are students in North Korea learning about the Korean War? What are students in Cuba learning about the Bay of Pigs? What are students in Russia learning about the Cold War? So at any point in time there was a contact between the U.S. and another country. What were those perspectives that had at that point in time? And by happenstance, I happened to have a conversation with somebody here at Indiana State, telling them about this project, and I was telling them this isn't the easiest thing in the world is to find all these history textbooks. And in the conversation, an off-the-cuff remark to me was, they said, you mean like the textbooks that they have over at the Cunningham Memorial Library? I thought to myself, in my own backyard, I've got all these textbooks here that I've been looking for around the world. And he said, yeah, you go to the special books collection. He said, I don't know if they're international or not, but they've got all those textbooks there. So I had the opportunity at that point in time to come over to the library. Went up to the special collections. There I had the opportunity to meet Dennis Petrovec and David Vansel, who, by the way, run a fantastic program up there. I can't thank these two gentlemen enough for all the help that they've given me with these projects over the years here. What happened, though, is within about 10 seconds, it dawned on me real quickly. They didn't have the international textbooks I was looking for. What they did have were all these old textbooks going back throughout American history. I think the oldest they have up there is 1796. I'll make reference to that one again a little later on here. What was interesting is I was also teaching a U.S. history survey class, and while I was doing that, I thought, okay, I'm here, they gave me these old books, this is going to be interesting. I'm going to sit down real quickly and take a look at what these old history textbooks said. There's one from like the 1820s, 1850s, 1880s, and what I thought was interesting, I sat down, I started reading about what I just lectured on the day before, and I noticed that the author from the 1820s basically completely disagreed with what I had just told my students the day before. So my first fear was, okay, the textbook might be right because I don't really know that much about this topic. So I thought I better do more research, and then here's all these other textbooks, so I thought I'll just keep reading this. And what happened is I kept paging through each of these different textbooks from different generations. I found that the stories had changed, different emphasis, different points that they were making. Sometimes what you read in one generation's textbook completely disappeared in the next generation. They highlighted something else, which, as was mentioned earlier, led to the book History in the Making, which looked at how these historical stories changed over time. I also had the pleasure of not only working at the library here, but as also a graduate student at Indiana State. And when History in the Making came out, I had the opportunity to take a class, and in that class we started talking about American education, the history of American education. And it dawned on me that I had missed something in my research. What I had always focused on was high school history textbooks. I hadn't focused on the 1st through 8th grade, the grammar school, the junior high school courses, the elementary school courses, if you will. And in that history class that we took, the point that was made is that a majority of Americans throughout U.S. history, if they were going on to education, it was that 1st through 8th grade education that they were getting. A high school education really doesn't come about until the 1940s, 1950s, somewhere in there, before you start seeing a lot of people really start getting on and getting a high school education. So that was the genesis for the idea of not written in stone. I wanted to go back and look and see what some of these elementary or grammar school, as they call them, and some of these junior high textbooks had. Again, I was fortunate to come back here to the 3rd floor and found dozens of these textbooks on the shelves up there, and which I can go back and look again. So the two things I wanted to accomplish with Not Written in Stone was, one, looking at what a majority of Americans probably learned. It's important to note here that history education throughout the last 200 to 300 years, one of the primary focuses has been citizenship. How are we going to develop young citizens with these history courses? That was one of the major goals that they had for all these. And the other thing was, after going to a number of conferences and giving other talks and other books, teachers and other people talked to me about putting in some discussion questions towards the end there so people could do more research. Real quickly before I move on here, one thing I do want people to know from Not Written in Stone and the other books that I have done is that I always tell them, and I mentioned this in the very openings of the very beginning of the books here as well, is don't come to these books looking for any answers. Actually, I refer to these as gateways. And what I hope happens is that people read these things, discover that interpretations, perspectives, and biases have changed over the years, and then inspire them to go on and do more of their own research. Actually come back to libraries like this, do more research on it, go to some of these historic sites and do things like that to figure out more about it as you can. As I constantly tell my students, history is one of the most fascinating topics that's out there. We cover absolutely everything. And I also make the point to my students and say, it's important to note that we Americans actually love history. Unfortunately, somewhere after the high school and college years, when we start getting a little bit older, and then we start looking back and going, well, this topic's really interesting. I can see how it impacts my life. I make a point and say, go to the local bookstore, if you will. Go to your Barnes & Noble, your Borders, your Books A Million, and just look at the history section alone. Usually one of the largest sections that's out there. People who are attending museums and historic sites are on the rise at this point in time. Hollywood churns out historic-based movies all the time. We have the History Channel, we have National Geographic, PBS is doing a number of things. History becomes very important. Genealogy has become much more popular in the past few years here as well. So my argument to my students that history constantly changes, I thought I could take these textbooks and I can use these as an example. This is where I'm going to be able to reach out to them and show them, here, this is how a student was looking at it in the 1790s, 1850s, 1940s, go on, just like that.